choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
In 1955, the United States government announced their intention to launch artificial satellites into space. It was just 2 years later that the Soviet Union successfully put Sputnik 1 into orbit, making them the first nation to reach outer space. It was this that fired the starting pistol that began the space race.
For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace.
In 1958, the two global superpowers began their competition to get to the moon. For the Soviets, it was the lunar missions, and for the Americans, it was the Pioneer. The initial goal of the Soviet lunar missions was pretty simple. Can we hit the moon? Can we fire an object into space at the right trajectory so that it collides with the surface? And they were pretty successful with Luna 2, which turned out to be the 7th mission into space. You see, until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, all of their failures had been kept under wraps pretty well. Between September 1958 and December 1965, the Russians were only successful in 3 of their 20 missions. But of course the general public only knew of the successes, and more importantly, so did the US government. The first American missions weren't all that successful either. The rockets, coincidentally named after the Norse god of thunder Thor used for the first 3 Pioneer missions, all failed to leave the Earth's atmosphere, and the mission after that misfired at the launch terminal. At this point, the Americans were trying to orbit the moon, a far stretch from just trying to crash into it. Pioneer 4 was successful in getting into space, but was so far from the moon that it ended up just orbiting the sun, where it still is, spinning around the sun. Between September 1958 and October 1962, an additional 9 missions failed, either trying to orbit or land on the moon. Ranger 4 successfully impacted it, at which point America decided to lower their expectations a little bit and join the Russians in just trying to fire things at it. So now that both countries had successfully impacted the moon, it was time to try landing softly. The Russians didn't get off to the greatest start. Luna 5 crash-landed into the moon. Luna 6 crash-landed into the moon. Luna 7 also crash-landed into the moon. And then Luna 8 gently came close to the surface of the moon, it spread out the legs of their landing module, and then it crash-landed into the moon. Not the best start. Finally, on the 31st of January 1966, Luna 9 successfully landed softly on the moon, a great win for the Russians. And now remember, the US didn't know anything about the failures that had happened before this, and this put them under immense pressure to achieve the same feat, which they did in May of the same year. After this point, the Russians had some mixed success. They tried to send up a lunar rover and couldn't launch the rocket. They tried to get some samples back from the moon and they couldn't launch the rocket. But that's not to say they didn't achieve anything. They did manage to send 2 tortoises up to the moon, orbit around the moon, and use the gravity to come back to Earth without using any more fuel. A monumental achievement. The Americans, however, were trying a new strategy, and they used their Gemini and Apollo missions to test a new theory. Could they launch from Earth, get to the moon, get into orbit around the moon, and then send down a lunar module from the orbiter? Then, on the 20th of July 1969, probably while the Russians were playing with tortoises, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the moon.
Yes, indeed.
Between then and the December of 1972, 5 more Apollo missions were successful in taking men to the moon. 24 US astronauts made the trip, 12 walked on the surface of the moon, the last being Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt of Apollo 17. It's important to remember that the US and Russia weren't the only 2 countries involved with going to the moon. During the 1970s, both Japan and India managed to successfully impact the surface. And much more recently, the Chinese have had some great successes. In December 2013, they became the first nation to land softly on the moon since 1976, and even more recently than that, in January of this year, they became the first nation to successfully land on the far side. Earlier this year, NASA revealed plans to go back to the moon in the next 5 years, setting their sights on its south pole, a place where no one has been before. However, India hope to beat them there by the end of this year. China's successful Chang'e missions will continue next year, when they hope to put men on the moon for the first time since 1972. The Russian plans were set for last year, but have been pushed back to 2025, when they hope to start the building of their moon base. No longer in competition with one another, the world is united in space exploration, and there are some amazing things planned in the future. But what will the fate of the moon be? Tune in next week to find out.